Proof number one, according to the Bible, Jesus was inaugurated as a priest at his baptism, not the Ascension. This is to say that according to the Bible, Jesus was inaugurated as a priest before his ascension. Now, the biblical evidence for this is plentiful. For starters, the law required that the Day of Atonement sacrifice be offered up by who? The high priest. Well, the Adventist organization claims that even though the antitypical Day of Atonement started in 1844 and is continuing to this day, that the antitypical Day of Atonement sacrifice took place at the cross. Notice Leviticus 16, 1 through 5. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron when they drew near before the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die. For I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. But in this way Aaron shall come into the holy place with a bull from the herd for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat and shall have the linen undergarments on his body, and he shall tie the linen sash around his waist and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water and then put them on. And he shall take from the congregation of the people of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 for a burnt offering." Thus the reading of God's holy word. So this is from the chapter regarding the Day of Atonement instructions and requirements. And who were the instructions given to? The Levites. Aaron and his descendants, which made up the Levitical priesthood order. And the law required that the Day of Atonement sin offering be carried out by the high priest, not just anyone, which would mean that Jesus, the true fulfillment of the antitypical Day of Atonement sacrifice, functioned as both the offering and the priest that offered it up. That was done at Calvary, which is before the Ascension. Secondly, notice Hebrews 2 and then Romans 3. Hebrews 2 and then Romans 3. Since therefore, well, halt. Let me preface. Before the author gets into this, he's talking about why Jesus is superior to the angels. This carries over from chapter 1. But he starts off by laying out his case at the beginning and in chapters 2, or chapters 1 and 2, that Jesus is superior to anything in creation, even the angels. And then he ends this chapter by saying, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. For surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Therefore, he had to be made in his brothers. He had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people." Thus, the reading of God's holy word. So, at this part of the book of Hebrews, like I said, the author is explaining how Jesus did not come to save angels, but humans, the offspring of Abraham. And part of that included adding unto himself a human nature. He had to be human in order to offer up a true atoning sacrifice for humans. And before this pericope, in verses 10 through 13, the author quotes the Old Testament, which foretold of this, that Jesus would not be ashamed to be called our brother, meaning adding unto himself a human nature. But in conjunction with all of that, what does he say in verse 17? That part of him adding unto himself human nature was to become a high priest in the service of God to what? Make propitiation for the sins of the people. So catch that. He came in human likeness, not to help angels, but humans. And part of that included becoming a high priest to make propitiation. Well, when did Jesus make propitiation? Because the text tells us that Jesus made propitiation as a high priest. So if propitiation occurred before the ascension, this further demonstrates Jesus was not inaugurated to be a priest or a high priest at the ascension, but at a point before. Well, Romans 3 tells us where propitiation occurred. I feel like we read this every week at this point, but I never tire of it. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there's no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And thus the reading of God's holy word. Now there's a lot here, and we've looked at this pericope a number of times, like I said, for various reasons. But when does the text say that propitiation occurred? When Christ was put forth, which was at Calvary. Propitiation occurred at Calvary, which means Jesus functioned as both the priest and the sacrifice at Calvary, which is perfectly in line with what we read in Leviticus as well as Hebrews 2. Not just Hebrews 2, but the entire book, more of which we're going to look at later, a lot more of. But do a word study, folks, on the Greek word for propitiation. We just talked about this last week with regards to the scapegoat. It has to do with what the priest did when he would sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat in the Day of Atonement ceremony. And we also looked at last week how SDA scholarship tries to make this work in their model. So you can go and catch that if you are curious. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. The point being, this further evidences that Jesus functioned as a priest prior to the ascension. The ascension was Christ's coronation as a king. Something that fundamental belief says nothing about. And we'll see why in a moment. Christ at his ascension continues in the execution of the office of priest, where he intercedes on behalf of his people as the bridge between God and man, as the God-man himself, which we will see in Hebrews 7 later, is something he will do forever. But that's one. Jesus was not inaugurated to be a priest at the ascension.